When I saw my husband flipping through my sketchbook, my heart skipped, not from fear, not at first, but because of the one page I'd forgotten to tear out. The one with the hand-drawn measurements. His brows furrowed as he flipped past dresses, coats, meaningless fabric notes, until he landed on that page. The one labeled only with an initial. I tried to reach for the book, pretending to need it, but he instinctively pulled it back. He kept reading, scanning numbers, the outlines of a male figure. I could almost hear the click in his head as his mind started forming connections. Not from proof, no, just from a gut feeling. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the page. I knew that look. He'd worn it when he found out about his friend's divorce, or when the neighbor's son was arrested. It was the face of a man realizing something he could never unrealize. My mouth went dry. I had forgotten how paper could betray you more than words. Especially when the paper held something intimate. Something unsaid. The silence between us grew thick, and I could hear every tick of the clock behind him. He turned to me slowly and asked, "Whose are these?" And all I could think was, not his. Not anymore. I felt the pressure build in my temples, the weight of everything I had buried. The worst part? He had no idea who it was. No idea how far it had gone. No idea that all of this started with something as small as a measuring tape. But before I explain how it spiraled into something I couldn't control, let me take you back. Before the page, before the sketch, before the first touch. And before I do, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever let something innocent go too far? It started with fabric. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But it did. With a pale gray cotton blend and the quiet rustle of pattern paper on my kitchen table. My husband had given me a voucher for a tailoring service, something fancy, personalized. It had been our anniversary, and instead of jewelry or perfume, he gave me a practical gift, the kind that says I know you like making things, without realizing I hadn't made anything in over 6 years. The voucher sat untouched for weeks. I told myself I was too busy. But the truth? I didn't know what to make. Until, one afternoon, I found myself staring at the hallway mirror and thinking about him, my stepfather. Technically, we were still family, though that word had long lost its shape. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe even a year. He had drifted out of our lives after my mother's death, first quietly, then completely. No calls. No cards. Just silence. The kind that builds its own weight in your chest. I don't know what possessed me to think of him when I saw the voucher. Maybe the idea of tailoring made me think of suits. Maybe suits made me think of him, how poorly his used to fit. He always wore jackets too tight around the shoulders, shirts that pulled around the buttons. I remembered once, as a teenager, wanting to fix them. I even took one of his coats and tried to tailor it, but gave up halfway. He never knew. Or maybe he did, and just never said anything. So I told my husband I'd use the voucher. But not for myself. I'd surprise my stepfather. I didn't call in advance. I took the train. I hadn't been to his place since the funeral, and even then, I hadn't stayed long. His apartment was still the same, a quiet, old, full of shadows that didn't move. He opened the door like he'd been expecting someone else. Then, when he saw me, he straightened, only slightly, but didn't smile. I asked if I could come in. He nodded once and stepped aside. It felt strange, stepping inside. The floor creaked the same way. The kitchen smelled like weak coffee and wood. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. I brought something, I said, unzipping the garment bag. It's not finished, but I thought. He didn't take it from me. He just looked at it. Then at me. I don't need clothes, he said, flat. I know, I replied, holding it tighter. But I need to make this. I don't know what made me say that. But once I did, he didn't argue. He just turned and walked toward the back room, his old study. I followed without asking. I unrolled the fabric, pinned the shoulder line, spread the pattern paper across the desk. His desk. It smelled like sawdust and leather. I laid the tape measure over the collarbone cut, but I could already feel my heartbeat in my throat. He stood a few feet away. I'll need your measurements, I said. His brow lifted slightly. For what? To finish the pattern. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. I didn't ask him to remove his shirt, and he didn't offer. I worked around it, taping from shoulder to wrist, from base of neck to waist. My fingers brushed against him more than once. Each time, he held still, stiff. Not cold. Not warm. Just aware. Present. Still the same shoulders, I murmured, without meaning to. You remember that? I used to stare at them, I said, instantly regretting it. He didn't respond. But he also didn't move. I continued down the sleeve, my hand gliding over his forearm, trying to pretend it was nothing more than work. But something in me had shifted. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was tight. Tense. I finished the front, then moved behind him, pinning the back panel. The curve of his spine. The way his body stood so straight, even now. I had the sudden memory of him lifting boxes when I was a teenager. That quiet strength. That always present control. I wondered if he ever noticed me watching. Do you ever miss her? I asked. He stiffened. Every day. Me too. The silence fell again. But this time it was different. Less heavy. Almost soft. When I finished, I stepped back. That's it, I said. He turned to face me. Our eyes met. I don't know who leaned forward first. Maybe neither of us did. Maybe it just happened. But that wasn't this chapter. Not yet. Instead, he nodded once, almost like a bow. Thank you, he said. And then walked me to the door. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of anything he did. But because of everything he didn't do. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir in me that had long been silent. Not desire. Not yet. But attention. And it was enough to terrify me. The next time I came back, I carried more than just fabric and pins. I told myself it was only about finishing the measurements, that it had to be done soon if I wanted the jacket ready before autumn. But the truth was simpler and harder. I wanted to be near him again. To feel that strange current under the silence, the way the air seemed heavier when we stood too close. He didn't greet me at the door this time. I rang once and it opened slowly, revealing him in a loose button-down and dark pants, barefoot. I noticed the way the hem of his shirt brushed his wrist, too long, again, and that flicker of annoyance returned. That he still wore clothes that didn't fit, that he hadn't fixed something so small after all these years. I won't stay long, I said, even though we both knew that wasn't true. He gestured toward the back, toward the same room. It had become a quiet ritual already. I'd lay out the tools on the desk, he'd stand in the middle of the room, arms slightly raised, silent. But today, something was different. The light came through the side window in a warmer hue, softening the edges of the room. Dust moved lazily in the sunbeam. The air felt still, as if holding its breath. I began with the shoulder again, rechecking the slope. My fingers brushed along the ridge of his collarbone, and I felt him stiffen, not from discomfort, but from awareness. I didn't say anything, just moved lower, measuring across the chest. I could feel his breathing, not quite steady. Neither was mine. I asked him to turn, just slightly, so I could get the angle of his back. He did. I stepped behind him, careful to keep the measuring tape from catching on his shirt. The cotton clung to his frame, and I noticed, without meaning to, how much strength still lingered there. Not youthful strength. Something older. Quieter. Steadier. As I worked, I let my fingers rest a moment too long on the midpoint of his spine. He didn't move. Neither did I. I told myself I was focusing, that precision mattered. That any mistake would show later in the seams. But I wasn't focused on seams. I was focused on the temperature of his skin beneath the fabric, the slight rise and fall of his breath, the fact that we were standing in silence and yet everything in the room felt deafening. When I moved around to the front again, we were closer than I'd planned. Much closer. He looked down at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. Not a request. Not desire, even. Just, are we really here? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I simply stood there, tape measure still in hand, inches from his chest. My fingers hovered between us, caught in that invisible tension. And then, we kissed. No words, no warning. Just that. A brief, hushed crossing of a line neither of us had spoken aloud, but both had approached slowly, inevitably. We kissed. And it was quiet. Almost clinical in its restraint. But beneath the surface, it trembled with something neither of us named. When I stepped back, I didn't look him in the eye. I packed up quickly, too quickly. My hands shook slightly as I folded the measuring tape, tucked away the pins, smoothed the fabric. He remained where he was, unmoving. I wanted him to say something. Anything. But I didn't ask. I left the room, and he followed me to the door. Outside, the sky had shifted, heavy with clouds. I realized I had forgotten my umbrella again. He noticed. You'll get caught in the rain, he said. I nodded. I don't mind. And I didn't. Not that day. The air on my face as I walked felt sharp, almost cleansing. But no amount of wind could clear what had just happened. I didn't go straight home. I wandered aimlessly for nearly an hour, letting my thoughts unravel with the passing streets. I replayed the moment over and over, our proximity, the pause before, the lack of resistance after. Not because I regretted it. But because it felt like the beginning of something I didn't understand. That night, I told my husband I'd stayed late at the fabric store. He didn't question it. He rarely did. He nodded, asked what I'd picked out, and returned to his book without waiting for an answer. I sat across from him, watching the curve of his brow, the way his eyes didn't flicker toward me once. We used to talk more in the evenings. I remembered when he would touch my hand just because it was there. Now, we had grown used to the silence, as if it was safer than trying. I told myself the kiss had been a mistake. A momentary lapse. I told myself I wouldn't go back. But later, in bed, I found myself thinking not of the kiss itself, but of his breath. The way it had caught just before. The warmth. The stillness. Something had changed. Not just in the room. In me. I lay awake long after the lights were out, the ceiling fan casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. I thought of all the years I had spent trying to be still, to be proper, to be good. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be any of those things anymore. Not because of him. But because of me. And still, beneath all that reflection, one quiet truth pulsed like a thread under fabric. I would go back. I didn't go back immediately. I thought about it. Several times. I even laid out the pattern paper one evening, smoothed the folds flat, traced the line where the shoulder seam would connect to the sleeve. But my hands hesitated before cutting. The fabric remained untouched for days. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew exactly what I was avoiding. My husband was the same as always. Predictable in the way that used to feel safe. Now it just felt distant. We had dinner, mostly in silence, the occasional comment about work or the neighbors filling the space between chews. He never asked why I seemed distracted. Maybe he noticed, maybe he didn't. Or maybe he preferred not to know. Sometimes I caught him looking at me a little too long, as if searching for a change in my face he couldn't define. I didn't volunteer anything. Instead, I busied myself with mundane things, closet reorganizing, grocery lists, emails I didn't need to answer. I found comfort in small, controllable tasks. The rhythm of folding clothes, the quiet hum of the dishwasher. Still, my mind returned again and again to that moment in the studio. The sound of his breath. The stillness. The way we hadn't said a single word after. It was on a rainy Thursday that I gave in. Not because I missed him, at least, not consciously, but because I left my sketchbook at his place. It was a weak excuse, flimsy and obvious. But it gave me something to say if anyone asked. I told my husband I needed to retrieve it. He nodded, distracted, sipping coffee and staring out the window. The rain tapped against the glass in slow rhythms, like time announcing itself. I didn't call ahead. I walked to his apartment from the station under a borrowed umbrella, the kind with half-bent spokes. I moved slowly, dragging my feet more than necessary, part of me hoping he wouldn't be home. That maybe I'd knock, retrieve the book, and be gone before anything could happen again. He opened the door before I could knock. "I saw you coming," he said. I stepped inside without answering. The apartment smelled the same old wood fabric and something earthy, like wet leaves. My sketchbook was already on the table. He must have looked through it. I wondered if he saw the drawings. I wondered if he recognized the unfinished jacket sketch that looked just like the one I started for him. He didn't mention it. Instead, he gestured toward the kitchen. "I made coffee," he said. I should have left. I should have thanked him, taken the book, and gone. But I didn't. I followed him into the kitchen like I belonged there. He poured 2 cups without asking how I liked it. He remembered. Still black, still plain. We sat at opposite sides of the table. A few feet of distance. A few feet of memory. Neither of us brought up what had happened. It hovered in the air like steam from the mugs, visible, warm, temporary. He looked tired. More than usual. Not sick, not weak, just worn. His jaw was unshaven, his shirt creased like he hadn't cared to iron it. I studied him in silence, and I knew he was doing the same to me. "You came back," he finally said. I nodded. "For the book." He didn't challenge the lie. Or maybe he accepted it as partial truth. The silence returned. Not hostile, not awkward, just there. Like a third presence in the room. I sipped the coffee slowly. It tasted burnt. I didn't mind. He asked how I'd been. I answered vaguely. I asked how he'd been. He shrugged. We danced around each other with the grace of people trying not to touch the bruise they both knew was there. Then, softly, almost absently, he asked, "Do you remember when you were 12 and you tried to fix one of my jackets?" I looked up, surprised. "I cut the lining wrong," I said. "Ruined the sleeves. You cried in the hallway for an hour." I remembered. I remembered sitting on the cold floor, scissors beside me, fabric bunched in my lap, ashamed and frustrated and heartbroken in a way only children understand. And I remembered he didn't come out. Not then. Not until much later. He brought me tea and said nothing. We never spoke of it again. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. I didn't know how, he said. Back then. The way he said it, back then, made me wonder if he meant more than just that night. I stared at the grain of the wood in the table, tracing it with my eyes. There were grooves and chips, places where time had worn it down. I suddenly wanted to touch it, to feel something solid. I didn't come here to talk about that, I said, though we both knew I didn't come for the book either. He nodded. But we are. Another silence. Then he stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just rose and stepped into the hallway. For a moment, I thought he was leaving. But he returned with something in his hands, an old coat. The one I'd ruined. The one I thought he had thrown away. I kept it, he said. Even after you left home. I never fixed it. Why? I didn't want it perfect. He placed it on the table. I stared at it, my throat tight. The lining was still crooked. The stitches uneven. It was a child's attempt at love, clumsy and visible. I reached out and touched it. Just once. And maybe that was the moment I realized something had shifted. Not in a dramatic, shattering way, but in a quiet, irreversible one. We were no longer circling a single mistake. We were standing inside a memory neither of us had spoken of for years, and yet it had been with us the entire time. I took the sketchbook. He walked me to the door again. But this time, we didn't pause. We didn't hold a look too long. He opened it, I stepped out, and the rain greeted me like an old friend. I didn't use the umbrella. I let it hang at my side as the water soaked through my coat, as my shoes squelched on the pavement. I walked to the station like I was moving through something I couldn't name. Not guilt. Not yet. But something that hummed just beneath the skin. And still, I knew clearer than before that I hadn't come for the book. And I would return again. It took longer than I expected to return, but not because I wasn't thinking about it. Quite the opposite. He began to take up more space in my thoughts, quietly, persistently, like a background noise I couldn't tune out. Even when I was in the middle of something ordinary, like rinsing dishes or folding towels, I would find my mind wandering back to his voice, his silence, the coat with the crooked lining. At night, I'd lie awake next to my husband, the hum of his breathing steady and soft beside me. Our bed had become a place of parallel solitude. We didn't touch much anymore, and when we did, it felt rehearsed. There was no hostility, just habit. I couldn't remember the last time he looked at me with surprise. Or the last time I felt seen. One afternoon, as I stood by the window with a cup of tea growing cold in my hand, I received a message from my husband. He had forwarded me an event link, a seminar about business psychology scheduled in a nearby city. Might be a good break for you, he'd written. Clear your head. I wasn't offended. I understood. He wasn't pushing me away, he was just offering me something I didn't know how to ask for. Distance. I clicked on the link, browsed the details, and booked the train. But I never registered for the seminar. Instead, I packed the unfinished jacket pieces, carefully wrapped in brown paper, and took the morning train in the opposite direction. I didn't text him to let him know I'd arrived. I didn't have to. He would either be home, or he wouldn't. It didn't feel like a risk anymore. It felt inevitable. The weather had turned colder. The wind bit through my coat, and the sky held that pale, strained light that comes before winter. As I approached his building, I felt a tightening in my chest, not fear, not quite anticipation. Something more fragile. Something that could still fall apart if I named it too soon. He opened the door before I knocked again. This time, he looked like he had been waiting, not anxiously, but knowingly. As if he had already prepared himself for what I might say or do. I didn't say anything at first. I stepped inside and handed him the package. He took it without looking inside, then placed it on the counter. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. "You didn't go to the seminar," he said. I shook my head. I wasn't sure whether I was more surprised that he knew or that he chose to say it aloud. "I wasn't interested," I replied. He nodded once, then turned and walked toward the back room. Again, that unspoken invitation. Again, I followed. Inside the studio, the fabric swatches were still pinned to the wall. The measuring tape still hung from the edge of the desk. It was like nothing had moved since I left, as if time paused there while the rest of the world kept turning. He gestured toward the mannequin. I laid out the pieces of the jacket, smoothing the fabric, aligning the seams. My hands moved with practiced ease, but my thoughts were scattered. I could feel his presence behind me, not close, but aware. I didn't have to look to know his eyes were on my hands. "I wanted to finish it," I said. "I hate leaving things incomplete." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward and picked up one of the sleeves. He ran his fingers along the hem, then placed it carefully back on the table. I could tell he was searching for something to say, but the words never came. I returned to work, adjusting the collar, checking alignment. As I bent over the table, I felt him move behind me, not touching, just closer. The silence between us grew thicker. There was no tension, no expectation. Just presence. After a long pause, he spoke. "I should have told you sooner. About her." His voice was low, almost rough. I didn't need to ask who he meant. "How long?" I asked, still not turning to face him. 15 years. Maybe more. On and off. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly. The weight of that number settled in my chest like a stone. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I knew you'd see it in me eventually. You always saw more than I gave." I turned then. Slowly. His face looked older in that light, but not weaker. Just more real. "Do you have a child?" I asked. He nodded. "A son. He's 14. The room seemed to shrink around us. That quiet, heavy truth filled every corner. "And you never told my mother?" I asked. I almost did. Twice. But I was too much of a coward, and she was too tired to hear more disappointment. I sat down, my knees suddenly unsure beneath me. The chair creaked under my weight, and I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. "You know what's strange?" I said. "I'm not angry. I thought I would be. But I'm just sad." He didn't respond. He just stood there, hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I kept telling myself you were distant because of grief," I said. "Because of her. Because of me. But maybe it was guilt. Or maybe just absence." He finally looked at me. "I never knew how to be what you needed." I nodded slowly. "And I never asked." For a long time, we didn't speak. The clock ticked on, the shadows shifted, and the room felt suspended in time. Then I stood and returned to the table, carefully folding the jacket pieces again. "I'm not sure I'll finish it," I said. "I thought I needed to. But now, maybe it's enough to let it stay unfinished." He stepped forward, placing his hand gently on top of the folded fabric. "Or maybe it's not about the jacket at all." I looked up at him. We stood there in silence again, not in tension, not in fear. Just truth. And in that moment, I understood something simple and quiet. It wasn't just the past that had brought me here. It wasn't grief or memory or guilt. It was the strange, unsettling realization that some things don't end because they break. Some things end because they finally surface. I picked up the jacket pieces and walked toward the door. He didn't stop me. He didn't follow. Outside, the cold air hit me like a wave. I wrapped the package tightly under my arm and began walking, unsure of where I was headed. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. Just unfinished. The days that followed blurred together. I tried to return to normal life, routine breakfasts, work emails, tidying corners of the house that no one noticed but me. But my thoughts kept drifting. Not dramatically, not even consciously at first, but slowly, subtly, like a gentle pull beneath the surface of my day. My husband remained as steady as ever. He asked polite questions about my trip, listened to my vague answers, and didn't pry. That was his way. He trusted me, or he didn't want to know. I wasn't sure which truth was worse. There were moments I looked at him across the kitchen table and wondered how we had ended up in this muted place. There had been a time, years ago, when I would rest my foot over his beneath the table without thinking. When he would slide a note into my bag just to say he missed me. But somewhere between bills, work, grief, and the years that quietly slipped past, we had become functional strangers. Not enemies. Just uninterested participants in the same quiet play. I told him I needed to take the finished piece back to my stepfather. I didn't say it like a question. He didn't ask how long I'd be gone. I packed the jacket into a clean garment bag, folded it neatly, pressed it again before leaving, though it didn't need it. I stared at it longer than necessary. It had turned out beautiful, simple lines, a fit that felt almost sculpted to the man I'd made it for. But beauty wasn't the reason I held it so tightly. I arrived mid-afternoon. His door was already slightly ajar. Whether he'd left it that way for me or had simply forgotten to close it properly, I didn't ask. I knocked softly anyway before stepping inside. He was in the kitchen, pouring tea, moving with a strange sense of calm, as though he had known this moment was coming. Maybe he had. I hung the jacket on a nearby hook, unzipping the bag slowly, letting the air around it shift as I peeled it open. He glanced over his shoulder but said nothing. I didn't need him to. The fabric spoke louder than either of us could have. We didn't sit down right away. I walked around the room like I was searching for something to anchor me, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the curtain, the side of the bookshelf where his old journals lined up in uneven stacks. He watched me move, silent but present. At some point, he stepped closer, stood behind me again, not invading, just there. The same distance as before. I could sense his breath shifting when I turned, and for a long moment, we didn't break the tension. It wasn't thick. It wasn't dangerous. It was careful. He reached out to touch the fabric, trailing his fingers across the lapel. I noticed the tremor in his hand, not age, not nerves, something else. You made it better than I imagined, he said. I nodded. It fit the shape of you. Not just the measurements. He studied me then. Eyes deep, searching, not for lies, but for the parts of me I hadn't yet shown him. I let him look. I was done pretending. He stepped back slightly and gestured toward the mirror in the hallway. I want to see how it fits, he said. I watched him slip into the jacket. It slid over his shoulders like it had been waiting for him. He buttoned it slowly, carefully, like a man touching something sacred. When he looked at his reflection, I saw the flicker of something unexpected, pride. And maybe loss. I stepped behind him, adjusting the collar, running my palm lightly along the seam near his shoulder blade, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing. He didn't move. He stood tall, still. Our eyes met in the mirror. The image held us for a moment too long. I never looked this good, he said with a dry smile. You always did, I replied. It was quiet then. Only the distant sound of traffic below the window, the occasional groan of old pipes in the walls. I turned him slightly, straightened the hem, brushed invisible dust from his chest. Our fingers touched once, briefly, and stayed. We kissed. We kissed again like before. No ceremony. No drama. Just that simple, silent breaking of a line that had long since faded. We kissed. And when it ended, neither of us said anything. There was no speech, no apology, no declaration. Just breath, and presence, and the knowledge that we were both already beyond whatever boundary we'd tried to draw. I stepped back, reached for the coat hanger, and helped him remove the jacket. He let me. Carefully, I folded it again and placed it back in the garment bag. My hands moved slower now. I should go, I said. He didn't try to stop me. But he followed me to the door, and for the first time, I felt the weight of goodbye. Outside, the light was starting to fade. The shadows stretched longer than usual, and the wind had turned colder. As I walked, I passed a small flower stand. I paused. I bought a single stem, a pale, half-bloomed lily, and carried it with me like an afterthought. When I reached home, my husband was on the couch, watching something on his tablet. He looked up, smiled politely, and asked how it went. I said it went well. He didn't ask more. Later that night, after the dishes had been put away and he had gone to bed early with a headache, I stood by the window and stared at the dark street. The lily lay on the counter behind me, untouched. I wondered if he noticed the way I had changed. I wondered if he even cared. And I wondered, more than anything, how far I was from the life I thought I had built. Or whether I had simply stepped into a different one without realizing it. I woke the next morning earlier than usual, my body heavy but my mind strangely alert. My husband was already up, standing in the kitchen in his robe, sipping coffee and flipping through his tablet. He looked calm, ordinary, exactly the way he always did at 7 a.m. But something in me had shifted overnight. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't relief either. It was a kind of numb clarity, the kind that settles in only when you've crossed a line you can't uncross and realize, to your surprise, that the world hasn't ended. He asked if I wanted eggs. I said no. He nodded and went back to reading. I watched him for a moment, the way he moved around the kitchen like everything made sense. Like I was still the same woman he married. Maybe, in his mind, I was. I felt like a shadow in my own home, visible, moving, but untouchable. Later that day, I visited a friend, an old colleague I hadn't seen in months. We met at a small cafe downtown, tucked between a florist and a used bookstore. She noticed something in me before we even sat down. You look different, she said, frowning thoughtfully. Brighter. Like someone's paying attention to you. I laughed it off, deflecting with a half smile and a sip of tea. But her words stuck with me. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too close to something I hadn't admitted out loud. When I returned home, my husband had made dinner, something simple, pasta and salad. He poured me a glass of wine without asking, the same kind he always bought, the one I never particularly liked. I thanked him, and we ate quietly, as we often did. After dinner, I told him I needed some time to think. I didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. Maybe he thought I meant work or family. Or maybe he knew, deep down, that there was something else shifting beneath the surface of our days. I packed a small overnight bag. Not much. Just the basics, comfortable clothes, my toothbrush, a journal I hadn't written in for years. I didn't tell him where I was going. He didn't ask. I left a note on the kitchen table, just in case. It only said, "I need space. I'll be back tomorrow." I didn't sign it. The drive took longer than I remembered. Traffic was heavy near the edge of the city, and the radio played songs I didn't recognize. I let it run in the background, noise filling the silence I didn't want to carry alone. I stopped once at a gas station, stood under the fluorescent lights, and stared at the vending machine as if choosing a candy bar might anchor me to something real. I bought gum and didn't chew it. By the time I reached the house, it was already dark. The porch light was on. I hadn't told him I was coming, but he opened the door almost as soon as I stepped out of the car. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I followed him inside, the familiar creak of the floor under my feet feeling like an echo of my previous visits. The house smelled the same: wood, dust, a hint of something herbal. I sat on the edge of the couch while he disappeared into the kitchen. He returned with a glass of water and placed it gently on the table beside me. There was something in the silence between us that didn't need naming anymore. A recognition. A pause before breath. We didn't say much that evening. We moved around each other quietly, as if words might rupture the balance we had found. He offered me the guest room, and I accepted. It was small but warm, the bed neatly made, a folded blanket at the foot. I placed my bag on the chair and stood for a moment, unsure of what I was doing there, unsure if he knew. But he did. He always had. He didn't knock. He waited. Eventually, I stepped into the hallway. He was in the living room, reading, the soft light from the standing lamp casting a long shadow across the floor. I crossed the room and sat beside him, not close, but not far. He looked over at me. "You're here." I nodded. I didn't know where else to go. "You don't need to explain." But part of me wanted to. Part of me needed to say something real, something more than just presence. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I said. He closed the book and placed it on the table. "That makes two of us." I felt the tension leave my body, not because things were easier, but because they were true. We sat in silence for a long time. The kind that doesn't beg to be filled. The kind that feels like home when nothing else does. And when the night grew late, and my eyes were heavy, he stood and held out his hand. We walked to the bedroom together. Neither of us spoke. We spent the night together. There was no ceremony, no drama, no reckless declarations. Just presence. Quiet, grounding presence. The kind that seeps into the skin and stays long after morning. When I woke, it was still dark. The house was silent. His breathing beside me was steady. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of the light from the window across the wall. I thought about what I had done. What we had done. Not with shame. Not even with fear. But with the full weight of knowing. And in that knowing, I realized something simple and terrible and true: there was no going back. Only forward. Whatever that meant. When I opened my eyes, the morning light had already crept through the curtain, casting a pale, hazy glow over the room. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I let the weight of the blanket rest over my legs, the silence stretch around me, the shape of the room anchor me in place. There was a dull ache in my chest, not sharp or sudden, but slow and familiar. The ache of something irreversible. He wasn't beside me anymore. I could hear faint sounds coming from the kitchen, water running, a chair shifting. I didn't rush to get up. Instead, I sat there, staring at the empty space on the bed, the small indentation where his body had been. The pillow was still slightly creased. I touched it, gently, and pulled my hand away as if it had burned me. I dressed slowly. My bag was still on the chair, untouched from the night before. I opened it, removed a fresh sweater, and sat on the edge of the bed to put it on. My hands moved through the motions without thought. Every gesture felt muted, as if I were underwater. When I stepped into the hallway, the smell of toast and black coffee greeted me. He was at the table, his sleeves rolled up, reading the newspaper as if everything was normal. As if last night hadn't tilted our world on its axis. He looked up briefly, nodded once, and returned to his reading. There was no morning after awkwardness. No weight of guilt between us. Just quiet. Measured, steady quiet. The kind that neither condemns nor forgives. He poured a cup of coffee for me without asking. I sat across from him, and we drank in silence. After a few minutes, he folded the newspaper and set it aside. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, watched as a bird landed on the balcony railing, fluttered once, and flew away. My fingers wrapped tightly around the mug, absorbing its warmth. "I'm not sure I even know how to explain it," I said finally. "Then don't." It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt like an invitation to stay in the gray, to avoid defining what we had done. And something in me, tired, raw, wanted to define it, if only so I could understand it better. "I need to go back," I said. "I know." I didn't expect him to argue, and he didn't. He simply stood, collected our mugs, and brought them to the sink. I watched him move, slow, deliberate, quiet in a way that felt permanent. While he washed, I gathered my things, folded the blanket on the guest bed, checked the corners of the room to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. I didn't want to leave a trace. That felt important. Even if it was already too late. As I stood at the door, coat in hand, he joined me. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. We just stood there, looking at each other, suspended in the silence of everything we hadn't said. He was the one who finally broke it. "You're not the only one who feels lost," he said. I nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat, and opened the door. The wind outside was sharper now. Colder. I stepped into it and didn't look back until I reached the car. He was still in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. I raised my hand in a small wave. He didn't return it. But he didn't close the door either. The drive home was long. My thoughts moved in circles. I replayed conversations in my head, imagined ones that hadn't happened. I tried to predict what I would say to my husband if he asked anything. What I could possibly offer that wouldn't shatter the fragile balance we'd built over years. When I stepped through the front door, the house was silent. His car was in the driveway, so I knew he was home. I found him in the living room, dozing lightly on the couch, the TV playing something he wasn't really watching. I stood there for a few seconds before making a sound. He stirred and looked up, blinking slowly. "You're back early," he said. I nodded. It was a short thing. He stretched, sat up, and patted the cushion next to him. "Want to sit?" I hesitated, then moved toward the chair instead. My body didn't want to be close. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the same way again. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't let it show. We sat in silence, the television filling the space with soft noise. I couldn't even tell what the program was about. I wasn't watching. Eventually, he turned to me. "Do you want to talk?" I didn't answer. I stared at the muted flicker of the screen, and the lump in my throat grew tighter. Not from guilt. But from the sheer weight of pretending. He waited. When it became clear I wouldn't answer, he leaned back, rubbed his face with both hands, and sighed. "I know something's been different," he said. "I don't need the details. I just..." I just want to know if you're still here." That question gutted me. Because I didn't know how to answer it. Not honestly. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to offer him the comfort of certainty. But my silence stretched, and his eyes lowered. We didn't say anything else that night. I went to bed early, alone. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster with my eyes. My fingers twitched against the sheet, searching for something they couldn't find. I thought about the guest room. The morning coffee. The weight of his jacket in my hands. And somewhere between exhaustion and wakefulness, I realized something undeniable. I had crossed a line. But the world had not collapsed. Instead, it had shifted imperceptibly but permanently. And I was still learning how to live with that. The days that followed passed with a kind of gray sameness, like mist that never quite lifted. I moved through them quietly, mechanically, tending to the routine I'd built over years of marriage: laundry folded, groceries stocked, calendars updated, small talk exchanged. Nothing was wrong, and that was the hardest part. Nothing had changed, but everything inside me felt different. I stopped by the pharmacy on a Thursday afternoon to pick up something I didn't really need. I told myself I was avoiding the silence at home, that I needed fresh air, that errands gave shape to my time. I didn't realize until I got home that I'd left the receipt in my coat pocket. Later that evening, my husband found it. I heard the crinkle of paper before I saw his face. He stood in the hallway, holding the slip between two fingers, squinting at the address. "This is across town," he said. I looked up from where I was seated, folding towels at the edge of the bed. I could see his mind trying to make sense of the name of the pharmacy, one he didn't recognize, one far from my usual route. "I needed something they didn't have nearby," I said. My voice was too even. He held my gaze for a moment. Not angry. Not suspicious. Just paused. Like he was waiting for me to offer more. I didn't. He placed the receipt on the dresser and walked away without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my back, eyes wide in the dark, listening to the quiet rise and fall of his breathing beside me. It struck me, not for the first time, how peaceful he looked when he was asleep. As if the worry and restraint he carried during the day finally released him for a few hours. I turned on my side, curled inward, and pressed my hands between my knees. The weight of what I'd done, what I hadn't said, what I'd carefully kept hidden, it rested on me like an extra layer of skin. I didn't feel regret in the way I expected. What I felt was exhaustion. A deep, endless tiredness from holding so many parts of myself in place. The next morning, he brewed coffee like always. Set the table. Didn't mention the receipt. I wanted him to. I wanted something to rupture, to shake us from the silence we had built together. But he didn't. And I didn't either. Instead, later that afternoon, he suggested something I hadn't expected. "We could talk to someone," he said as he stood near the sink, rinsing a glass. I looked up. Someone? Like a counselor. Maybe it would help. I don't know. Maybe not. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know how to say no without sounding cruel. "That's not a bad idea," I said. But I didn't call anyone. Instead, I wrote a message. It was simple. I told him I needed to see him. I didn't say why. I didn't ask if he was free. I just said I was coming. I packed nothing this time. No jacket. No bag. Just my keys, my phone, and a strange hollow feeling in my chest I couldn't name. When I arrived, he didn't open the door right away. I knocked twice, gently, and waited. When he did appear, he looked surprised, but not unsettled. As if he'd stopped expecting me, but wasn't shocked to see me either. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We didn't speak for a few minutes. I stood by the window, tracing my finger along the edge of the sill. The paint was chipped. I remembered when it used to be fresh. I remembered when I'd sat in this room as a girl, pretending to be older than I was, waiting for someone to ask me what I wanted. "You shouldn't have come," he said eventually. "I know. I meant it when I said we couldn't do this again." "I know." He sat in the old chair near the bookshelves, the one with the faded cushion and the loose leg. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. The way people look when they carry too much and never say it aloud. "You didn't come to stay," he said. "No." "Then why?" I didn't answer right away. I moved toward the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. "Because I can't breathe in my house," I said. "Because every room feels like it's shrinking." He looked down at his hands, folded in his lap. "And this one doesn't?" "It does," I said. "But at least here, the silence means something." I sat across from him. We didn't touch. We didn't move. The air between us felt too fragile. "I told my husband we should see a counselor," I said. He said yes. I said yes. "But you didn't call anyone." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't know what I'd say," I replied. "And I don't know if I want to fix it or just stop pretending." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The light from the window cut across his face, sharp and uneven. I noticed a faint scar near his temple I had never seen before. It made him look more human. "We've done something we can't undo," he said. "I know. And we're not brave enough to face the consequences." "No." A long silence passed between us. Not uncomfortable. Just final. "I'm not coming back again," I said. He nodded. "I believe you." And somehow, that hurt more than if he had begged me to stay. I stood, placed the glass in the sink, and moved toward the door. As I reached for the handle, he spoke one last time. "I hope you find the version of yourself that doesn't need to keep breaking." I paused, my hand resting against the wood, and let his words settle into me. "I hope you do too," I said. Then I stepped outside, the cold air brushing my face like a question. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just walked to my car and drove away, not toward clarity, not toward resolution, just forward. The silence inside me finally began to shift. Not into noise, but into something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space. The rain started sometime after midnight. I heard it in the distance first, a faint tapping, like fingers on a wooden table, before it built into a steady rhythm against the roof and windows. I lay awake, eyes open in the dark, staring at the soft shadow of the ceiling fan above me. My husband lay beside me, breathing slow and deep, his arm resting over his chest. He hadn't said much since the receipt, and neither had I. We existed in parallel again, two people who knew far more than they were ready to say. The weight of unspoken truths hung heavy in the air. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, lodged just below my collarbone. I hadn't returned to the other house. I hadn't texted. I hadn't even looked at the jacket hanging in the back of my closet, the one I couldn't bring myself to discard. Instead, I had drifted. Inside my own life. Completing tasks, tending to things, keeping my hands busy to quiet the noise in my head. But it wasn't working anymore. The quiet was too loud. That morning, I woke before the sun. I slipped from bed carefully, moving like someone who didn't want to be caught in their own house. The kitchen felt cold, and I turned on the kettle more for the comfort of the sound than for the tea itself. As I waited, I wandered into the small room where I kept old journals, paper scraps, and boxes filled with things I hadn't touched in years. On the top shelf sat a box I hadn't opened since my mother died. It was labeled in her handwriting, letters. I pulled it down gently, brushing dust from the lid. The smell of old paper rose to meet me when I opened it. Most of the contents were cards, birthday notes, a few newspaper clippings she'd saved, meaningless at first glance, but important enough for her to tuck away. Then I found a small envelope, unsealed, without a stamp. It had my name on it. I unfolded the paper slowly, my hands trembling. The letter was short. Just a few lines, written in her narrow, slanted script. I know you've always felt a distance between you and him. I did too. But there were times I saw the way he looked at you, and I wasn't sure what frightened me more, what he saw, or what you didn't. I read the words again and again. My breath caught in my throat. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. It didn't feel like an accusation. It didn't even feel like a warning. It felt like someone trying to leave a thread of truth behind, just in case I ever needed it. By the time my husband came into the kitchen, the letter was already back in the box. I had made breakfast, toast, fruit, coffee. He sat down across from me and offered a small smile. I returned it, but I didn't speak. He didn't bring up the counselor again. He didn't ask where I had gone last time or why I had come back looking so much older than I had the day before. Instead, he told me he'd be working late, and I nodded. When he left, I stood in the doorway a little too long, watching the taillights of his car fade down the street. It wasn't longing I felt. Or grief. It was something stranger. Like a curtain closing on a play I'd already seen too many times. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. The name on the corner of the envelope was one I hadn't heard in years, his former partner's. The woman he had lived with for nearly 15 years. I opened it on the porch, standing under the weak light of a cloudy sky. Inside was a photograph. A boy, maybe 12 or 13, standing on a school stage, holding a certificate. He looked proud, nervous, slightly out of place. But what stunned me was the jacket he wore. It was unmistakably the one I had made. My design. My stitching. My hands in the seams. The note was simple. I thought you should know. He gave it to our son. Said it was too beautiful to hang in a closet. I read it twice. Then I folded the letter and the photograph and slid them into the back of my journal. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stood there, letting the wind bite at my skin, letting the truth of it settle into my bones. He had given the jacket away. And somehow, I felt lighter. I didn't drive to his house. I didn't send a message. I didn't ask for an explanation. Instead, I walked through the park near our home, watching the last leaves fall from the trees. The air smelled like earth and cold stone. Children's laughter echoed from a distance, and I followed the sound absently, letting it lead me nowhere in particular. I sat on a bench for a long time, hands in my lap, knees tucked close. I watched people pass, young couples, old friends, women with strollers. None of them looked at me. And that was fine. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to feel the world move without me for a while. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. My husband hadn't come back yet. I stood in the hallway, staring at our wedding photo on the wall. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt done. Not with him. Not with love. But with pretending. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to him. Not to my husband. Not even to myself. I wrote it for the woman I used to be. The one who tried so hard to fix things that were never hers to fix. The one who believed silence meant safety. The one who gave parts of herself away to people who never asked for them. I told her it was okay to stop. I told her she wasn't broken. And I told her the truth, that the hardest part of love isn't the ending. It's knowing when to let go of the version of yourself you created just to survive it. When I finished writing, I tore the page out, folded it once, and placed it under the same box with my mother's note. Then I turned off the lights, walked into the bedroom, and lay down. Not to sleep, but to rest. For the first time in a long time, without apology.